suggested on library loan. And so if you're really interested, this would be a source. I do have a little bit of information from a book that's actually in your library, no longer in ours, which it should be. It's the history of Wisconsin's grape canning industry, written by Fred Stair, who was from Columbus, and that's at the library in town here. To start out in talking about World War prisoner of war camps, I think we have to have a little bit of the context of what was happening in 1944 and 1945. And it was a severe shortage of workers. Now, if you read the history books, the first thing you'll find is that they will mention that, why was there a shortage? Well, everybody was off for war. That's true, but they miss the almost as important situation, and that's the war industries. And just looking at a couple of things from Fred Stair, and he's referencing Columbus. As an illustration, the Chamber of Commerce of Columbus, a small city around 3,000 people, were authority for the statement that more than 200 men and women residents of Columbus were driving or being driven daily to work in factories. In Madison, Beaver Dam, and the Badger Ordnance Works, some 4,000 to 8,000 people worked at Badger Ordnance during the war. It was the biggest ammunition plant in the United States. And so they bused people up there from a radius of about 100 miles. So yes, there was a shortage. The shortage was because of our soldiers overseas, but there was also a shortage because people working in the factories. If you think of Wisconsin, submarines in Manitowoc, patrol boats in Sturgeon Bay, Kohler Company made brass artillery shells. Milwaukee had all kinds of manufacturing plants that were also a part of the war effort. So this was kind of the reason that there was this huge, horrible shortage of workers. The Columbus Canning Company suggested that if they were going to can peas and corn, they absolutely had to have more help. They had enough help to run the plant at a third of capacity, and so there was this huge shortage. So what's the solution? Maybe I'll let Helen deal with this until she's on. Oh.
This one?
Okay, good. Okay, so the solution that people came up with were prisoners of war. Now, prisoners of war were treated very, very differently. The United States, and these are prisoners of war, I believe, from Columbus on the left, and American prisoners of war on the right. Geneva Convention had certain requirements. The prisoners of war in the United States were far, far better off than prisoners of war in other places. The other thing that we should say is we are talking about prisoner of war camps that security-wise were at the very, very lowest level. These weren't hardened Nazis that were in these camps. In many cases, they were privates, they were farmers, they were, middle-class people. And so there were other places in the United States. If you were an officer, if you were in the SS, if you were a dyed-in-the-wool Nazi, there were other places that you were at. You weren't in Cambria, you weren't in Columbus. You were in some of these other places. There's estimates that only 10 to 15% of the German soldiers were dyed-in-the-wool Nazis that were totally behind Hitler. A lot of them were conscripts, people that got drafted in the army, and we're certainly German citizens. Some of them had been in, Hitler Youth organizations and things like that, because it probably was safer to do that than to not do that. So what happened in 1944, well, actually, going back a little bit further, Camp McCoy had been a civilian conservation camp near Sparta, Toma. In 1942, it became the main base camp. That camp had, and we have the statistics, I think, later on, housed a number of soldiers, a number of prisoners of war, including a number of Japanese prisoners of war. There was a huge difference between the Germans and the Japanese. The Japanese did not integrate well into the situation of being a prisoner of war. The Germans were far, far better at it. So a series of base camps were built. Fort McCoy became the main center, and then they built 38 branch camps in Wisconsin. Why have German prisoners of war in the United States? Well, the first place there were prisoners of war is there were prisoners of war in Britain. But if you have 300,000-400,000 prisoners, you need all kinds of people to guard them. And so it was felt that if you sent them to the United States, it was far easier to take care of them and not interfere with the war effort. So we sent supplies to England, France, etc. Those empty Liberty ships ended up with German prisoners of war on the way back. And most of them were sent to the Midwest.
There's your Liberty ships numbers.
Okay, Wisconsin housed over 20,000 enemy soldiers across the state in camps, in branch camps. England just didn't have the capacity to keep the German prisoners. There was a fear that the Nazis, if you had them in England, would drop weapons and there would be a great escape. One of the things the German prisoners realized is that trying to escape from Middle America to get back to Germany just wasn't in the cards. One prisoner had said there was too big an ocean to swim across to try to get back to Germany, and trying to escape Canada wouldn't do you any good because Canada was an ally. So really having them in the interior of the United States was a situation that worked out the best. Okay, some 400,000 Germans, some 5,400 Japanese, a few Koreans, and a few from other places. Okay, 400 base camps are formed across the United States. The PWs were transported by a railroad car. It says they traveled first class. The suggestion there is you didn't pile them into cattle cars. Some of the stories that we have of World War II of prisoners being sent from one place to another. That wasn't the case in the United States. They were in a regular passenger car. They did have guards in each car, and they were given water to drink and provided meals. Okay, this is from the book. These are the locations of the various camps in the state of Wisconsin. And in this book that I made reference to, there is a short 2-3 page chapter on each individual camp. One of the things we're gonna suggest later on is there's 3 pages on Cambria that you might be interested in.
Thank you, Peter. So my name is Helen, and I actually also work at Columbus Public Library, where I also know Peter. And we're like, history is so amazing, so this is such a great opportunity to be here. So it's kind of unique. Maybe some of you were thinking that we forgot the O in the POW, but we did not. It was actually not until the 1950s that prisoners of war were labeled as POWs. Prior to that, they were PWs. So this is also, this lists out the names on the back of the book as we were talking about. So right here's Columbus and here's Cambria. So these prisoner of war camps, they were not quite top secret. There was very little information given to the public, but it was still kind of hush-hush on the part of the government in order to avoid panic, animosity, and fraternization between the Americans and the German prisoners of war. However, after the war ended in 1945, local press was invited to see Camp Columbus. The press corps, they actually had a lot of questions about how well the prisoners were being treated. They had a lot of concerns regarding the types of food that they ate. They thought that it sounded too nice for them. Unfortunately, a lot of the records regarding the camps was destroyed in the 1950s. We're not exactly sure why. It's pretty unfortunate that it was. I'm hoping that someday we can maybe dig up a little bit more information. Peter, could you pass me that notebook too, please? So, since we're from the Columbus area, thank you, we're going to talk about Columbus as well as the Cambria area. Are any of you connected to Columbus at all? Okay, it's a minority. So are the rest of you from Cambria, Friesland area? Okay, is anyone here from Randolph? Okay, what about Partyville? All right, so Friesland actually wasn't incorporated until 1946. So I was looking up the census numbers on Friesland, and there weren't any prior to 1950, because there was a 1930 census, a 1940 census, and a 1950 census. So all of you from Friesland, you totally took the numbers down in the population in Randolph after the war. So I think that's pretty interesting. We'll be getting to more of that a little bit later. But so, why was Columbus one of the sites chosen? Well, it was a rural community, and it had a very large number of properties that were growing peas, and they really needed help, as Peter was saying, with their pea harvest due to the labor shortage that was across the nation. Also, Wisconsin's large German population, especially around the Columbus area, was very appealing to the Army, in part because, as we've discussed earlier, the fact that there may not be as much animosity and more connections there. So, the U.S. Census population for Columbus in 1940 listed that city as having 2,760 residents. By 1950, it had grown up to 3,250 residents, which was pretty exciting. Now, Cambria, I know that Cambria is more Welsh-oriented, is that right, in your founding? But there are still Germans living in the area and possibly working here. I did find in my research that there were several folks from Columbus coming to work, and from Fall River coming to work at the Cambria canning factories especially in the early days. So this was a very valuable location for the Army due to the several local canneries placed here. And here we have some more census numbers. So part of the reason I'm including this is so that when you hear about the numbers of German prisoners of war that were here, you'll see how much it increased. So like how they really made quite the numbers rise. So in 1940 in Cambria, there were 688 residents. And by 1950, that number dropped down to 633. That could be for any number of reasons, whether it was, you know, impacts from the war, or people just moving around as well to other locations. Here I have the numbers on the village of Friesland. So in 1940, no results, and again, it was incorporated from part of Randolph Town in 1946. But by 1950, there were 311. And so you can see here, look at the dramatic drop in Randolph population. 1,262 residents in 1940, and by 1950, only 837. So that 311 right there really took a toll on the resident numbers. So we're going to set the scene a little bit for what German prisoners of war would have seen in Columbus, and some of the landmarks that we know today over in that city. So here, this is from the Recollection Wisconsin website, the Columbus Area Historical Society collection of postcards on there. Cambria also has a wonderful collection of your materials also on the same website. So if you're curious to learn more, especially about this topic, you will find a whole notebook digitized on there. I actually have a printout of that here too. So in Columbus, this was the water fountain that was in front of City Hall. This picture actually though is from about 1900. And you can see how it would have had, it's kind of cut off here, but you can see where like dogs and cats, like they purposely made little areas for the water to collect there. And then also, you know, humans or horses. It depends on what level it's at there. It's kind of hard to see. But often these water fountains would have various levels. Usually they'd have even a third tier in there for humans, then horses, and then any other local animal population. So here we have a postcard of the St. Mary's Hospital on the original James Street site. This postcard is circa 1930, and the 3-story building was erected in 1928. So this is also something that the prisoners of war would have been seeing when they were in Columbus, working at the canning factory there, and imprisoned in the camp. Here's a picture of our library. It's a Carnegie Library. It was built in 1912. This postcard is from 1937. So in the 1930s and 40s, the library was known as the Carnegie Library. I'm really excited about this slide because we're going to see a really nice comparison between this and the entrance to Cambria Park in an undated photo, but about the same time period. So when you are in Columbus and you're driving down the main road, there's the Fireman's Pavilion. Have any of you seen that down there? Mm-hmm. Yep, so there it is right there. And to the left of it, there's actually a smaller building, which was where the tourists could stop and pay their admission fee for coming into the park. It was known as the City Park and Tourist Camp at that time. So just like a state park, you'd pull up and there'd be an attendant that would take your money and get you logged in, and then you'd camp there. And then this is the Rest Haven building. This building is about to celebrate its 100th anniversary here in 2023 that it's happening. Yeah, because last year we were saying next year, and now it is next year. So this park was a favorite place for motorists and campers to visit, and in 1923, this Rest Haven building back here, it was built with a donation of $10,000, and it was able to provide users with restroom and cooking facilities. I'm not sure if you've been there recently, but it's about to embark on a restoration process, or project, date TBD. Now, here we are back in Cambria. So this is the main street in 1935. Does this look familiar? Yeah. I love finding cars of main streets with the vehicles in them. It's so great. Here is probably a site that was very familiar to the German prisoners of war. It's the German Lutheran Church, as you know. A lot of these next photos and postcards, they're undated. These are also on the Recollection Wisconsin website from the Cambria Friesland Historical Society. So this belongs to you. This one also, does anyone have any memories of the Fred Fritz Evans pool home?
Yeah, played pool there every noon.
There you go. Was that you holding up the bar right there? You aged well, really well. Awesome. All right, so then here's that comparison I was mentioning. Here are the stone columns of the park. And then, see back over there, here's a close-up of the activity going on. These may very well have been taken on the same day. I'm not positive, but I'm just speculating here, because it does look very, very busy in the background there, as is here. So unfortunately, these photos are, again, undated. If any of you do know the dates of these, that would be great. I'd love to update that. So where did prisoners of war work in Columbus? So we have the Dry Milk Company in Columbus, Wisconsin. So, so that postcard was actually from about 1940, and it was of the dairy condensery plant on West James Street. So that's the end of town that's closer to the Pick and Save, the Roberts Manufacturing, and all in that direction over there. So the Dry Mill Company of New York opened this facility in late 1923. The company was sold to Borden's in the 1930s, and the plant continued operation until the late 1950s, when the popularity of dried milk products waned with the increasing prevalence of household electric refrigerators, making it easier to keep fresh milk year-round. So one of the really neat things about the Borden dry milk plant was that prisoners who worked there, ice cream was a very common dessert for them, because when they'd be working on the night shift, 75 to 100 prisoners of war would load up 2 railroad boxcars with cans of ice cream powder. Most of those were headed for the Navy. The test samples were regularly distributed to the employees, including the prisoners of war. At that time, Borden's processed about 200,000 pounds of milk. Oh, I'm sorry, about 200,000 pounds of milk a day into the powdered ice cream mix. And in addition to the local product, railroad tanker cars from across the country were arriving daily, full of the powdered ice cream in order to be canned there as well. So both ends of the production of dried milk and the ice cream powder. The prisoners worked 2 shifts a day, 7 days a week, helping to keep the factory going year-round. The plant fed the prisoners their noon meal or a midnight lunch. So they had a pretty good deal. I eat ice cream. But again, they were prisoners of war, so they didn't really have a good deal. Even if you get to eat ice cream all day, that's not a very good exchange. So, I bet lots of us have visited the Columbus Antiques Mall. Well, it was once the Columbus Foods Corporation. Let me get caught up. Right. So, Raminda, I bet a lot of you used to buy Raminda brand. Well, on the labels, it said that it was packed by Columbus Foods Corporation in Columbus, Wisconsin. So we were getting the word out all across the country on that. Canning peas at the Columbus Food Corporation was the other main business in town where the prisoners of war were employed. Well, were working, I should say, numbering about 150 of them. The pea crop in 1945 was so large that soldiers from Truax Field were actually sent to help and work during their hours off duty. Now this was fairly common at the canning factories around the area, but it was a strain on the resources for the soldiers. That's why the prisoners of war, another reason why the prisoners of war were so important. The prisoners of war and the soldiers were working almost side by side, but no conflict is documented. So they were canning peas and corn at the plant from 1944 to 1945. And in 1946, the Columbus Food Corporation became the Stokely Van Camps. So that was a little bit on the background of the facility itself. Now Camp Columbus, where the prisoners of war were living. They needed to make several changes in Columbus in order to house the prisoners of war. Prisoners and military guards were added to the population, and also improvements were made, especially with the sheep sheds, which were overhauled, scrubbed, sanitized, and insulated in order to provide barracks for the prisoners of war, and also in order to follow Geneva Convention guidelines. From Columbus, after the pea harvest ended, those prisoners were sent up to Sturgeon Bay in order to help with the cherry crop. But 275 prisoners returned to Columbus after that in order to pick and detassel corn and pack it at the canning factory. In mid-October of 1945, the corn pack ended and the Camp Columbus closed permanently. So life at Camp Cambria from 1944 to 1945. Camp Cambria was located on the W.H. Manthe property west of the Cambria village limits. Preparations began even before the prisoners of war arrived on June 10th and on June 10 of 1944. Housing was prepared for both the German prisoners of war and Jamaican migrant workers. I thought that was an interesting fact, that Jamaican migrant workers were here, but guess what? They were British subjects at that time in the 1940s. So they would have been very trustworthy to have working side by side with German prisoners of war. You have allies working with you, subjects of your allies, and then also prisoners of war. So at that time in 1944, approximately 675 Germans and 358 Jamaicans came and were living in Cambria and working on the contracts. So thinking back to what the census numbers were, that's about 1,100 people. So that really increased. At the time, 1940 to 1950, you went from 688 residents down to 633, and you're adding in another 675. I mean, it's almost like one German prisoner of war to one resident of Cambria, plus then also the Jamaican migrant workers. Okay. Now, one interesting difference that I found in the research is that in Columbus, prisoners of war had to work 12-hour shifts a day, but in Cambria, at the different canning companies and Friesland and Partyville, the contract was for 8 hours a day and a 10-minute break every hour. So, yeah, it's pretty different. Yeah, and so then, of those 675, some did get said they were living at Camp Cambria, and then they were trucked over each day to work in Partyville and in Friesland. So then, by 1945, the following year, here are all of the numbers of who was working where. And then also, some of them performed camp maintenance, which Peter will be talking a little bit more about in a little bit. So we have records for Columbus, Wisconsin, Camp Columbus, prisoners of war, and also Camp Cambria prisoners of war moving, to the logging camps in Michigan for the winter. So specifically from, Cambria, they were moved to Fox Lake first. So then, where were they working in Cambria? Does this look familiar? Cambria Canning Company, Cambria, Wisconsin. This is another one of the Recollection Wisconsin photos, which is from your Historical Society's collection. So today, keeping in mind, so yes, Seneca Foods bought out Del Monte. So there are the locations and primary uses and sizes. But I thought it was very interesting. I found an article from when the sale was happening. It was in the Wisconsin State Farmer in 2019. Cambria Del Monte plant employs about 40 to 50 full-time employees and 280 seasonal employees that help process and can crops of peas, green beans, and whole kernel corn. That's not very many compared to how many people were working there during World War II as prisoners of war. So I found this really fantastic picture of the pea wagons. But this one's a lot earlier. This photo, this postcard is actually dated as 1912. But again, this is from Cambria. I mean, those vines, it's amazing. So these are some amazing photos. I know I keep saying amazing. But history, it's amazing. It's sad, it's tragic, it's incredible, it's all kinds of things. But seeing these people working in the canning factory, like you can put stories with them, like even up close some of their faces. Here are the men standing in the cooker room. I feel like this is from around the same time as the pea wagon, like the clothing and things. This looks to me about 19-teens or so, 1920s. Maybe even some of you are related to them. Here's an up close of the employees of the Cambria canning factory. The filling room. I think this guy looks cool. I like his posture. I think it's a pretty cool photo. And that one lady, she's in 2 of the photos. She's not moving. There she is. There she is, working hard, super hard. All right. Are we switching? No. Okay. So we have some other great photographs. A lot of these are from the Wisconsin State Historical Society. Photos from Columbus, Camp Columbus actually. So we've got pictures of them marching to the trucks to be taken to Columbus Food Corporation cannery. There they are, more pea vines. Note the uniform. So this was the clothing that they wore. And this guy, his apparently needed to be redone a couple times. The laundry, you'll see how they did their laundry. It was quite the wear and tear. But, they had to be marked as prisoners of war so that if they were found walking around town or anywhere, that they would know that the residents would know they needed to return to camp. So prisoners of war who worked at the camps, they also engaged in activities like helping bake the bread for the rest of the camp. They were taking English camps at the time as well. They were building furniture. And, a lot of them were using the tasks that they brought with them from the motherland. I think this slide is yours, Peter.
Yep. We rather strictly went by the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention said that only privates had to work, officers did not have to work. The Geneva Convention said that you couldn't hire them and put them in places that it was a part of a military operation. In other words, you couldn't put them in a factory that was making shells or tanks or jeeps or whatever. And they also could not have them working in places that were extremely dangerous. I would think that would be something like, you couldn't put them in a coal mine or, some other places that were particularly dangerous. Borden's ice cream dry milk plant was important, in a large part because if you remember during the war, there was rationing. We rationed milk, sugar, gasoline, tires, butter. I don't know if I'm missing anything. So this was one of these rationed items. Amazingly, the agriculture was not a priority area. The priority was manufacturing, the war effort, and for some reason, agriculture was further down the line. Columbus Food Corporation was the largest pea canning company in the state. At various times, they canned just about everything. They canned corn, peas, tomatoes. I don't think they did green beans, but if you consider the canning industry in Wisconsin, green beans, cranberries, corn, peas, what?
Lima beans.
Lima beans, right? So there was a whole series of things. PWs at the rank of private were laborers. Okay, another thing they canned was cabbage, which I guess basically would be sauerkraut. One of the things we haven't mentioned so far in this is we've talked a lot about prisoners of war working in the various food processing plants. There were a lot of them that were also hired out to individual farmers. So if you had a farm, and your two boys were off to war, and it was time to cut hay, you might call up and say, hey, I need 2 or 3 prisoners. The rules changed over the years. The government really didn't know what they were doing at the start on what would work, and at first there was a yard for every 10 prisoners that was working in the fields. After a while they decided that that didn't work, and it got to the point where pretty much at the end, if you needed 5 guys, they dropped them off in the truck and said, well, we'll pick you up at 6 o'clock at night. So there was very little control over the prisoners. Prisoners were quite happy to be working out in the sunshine. They weren't in the cell. Many of them did the same thing back in Germany anyway, so it was really not all that different. There's some great stories. There's a story of one farmer who had cut his hay, and there was a rainstorm coming, and if the rain fell on the hay, it was going to be ruined. So he convinced the prisoners of war to hurry up and get it in the barn. Their reward was a bottle of beer and a cigar. And I don't want to say too much because I think Helen's going to talk a little bit more about some of the things that they did get. Okay, Mike, do the next one?
I'm doing the next one, and then,
Okay.
yeah, and maybe you'll be back for the recollections.
Okay.
So Peter used to be a history teacher and a librarian.
And I worked at a canning company.
So I just learned so much from Peter all the time. Like, it's just, thank you for us doing this presentation together, Peter. So, I totally forgot to include the picture of Camp Cambria. I'm so bummed with myself. But it is on this packet. This packet it excludes, I think that there might be one news article missing, but this is the online journal on the prisoner of war camps that Cambria-Friesland Historical Society donated, put online on the Milwaukee Recollections Wisconsin website. So I will pass this around, and on the front page is the photo I forgot to include.
I'll put it on our Facebook page.
Oh, thank you, perfect, excellent. So, this is a view of the Columbus camp from above. The tents are kind of different shapes, you'll see when the picture gets around to the rest of you. And this camp was actually located, if you're coming into Columbus, if you're headed out of town and you're going towards like Hartford and that end of things, just at the river to the left, that's where the sheep sheds were located, and the tents that the prisoners were housed in. So, as Peter was saying, like, they were following the Geneva Convention guidelines super closely in this area. Is it okay if I take questions at the end? Is that, or do you, what's your comment or question?
In Elba,
Columbus. This is still
it was
Columbus.
in Columbus?
There
or-
were two canning companies in what's either Alva or Astico,
Mhm.
you know, it
Yeah.
goes by both names. The sheep sheds were right outside of Columbus, they still exist.
By the Antiques Mall. It's like, is it Campbell?
Well, it'd be,
It'd be like, but that end, like tucked in off of James Street.
At that time, Columbia County and Dodge County were the largest producers of canning peas and sweet corn.
Exactly, I think you're a
Yes.
fan of canning companies and pubs. That's great, good. Yeah, so when they were building the accommodations for the prisoners of war, it actually did help the local Columbus economy by bringing in new jobs in construction in order to provide housing. But these jobs were also possible for the prisoners and for camp workers. Religious services and recreational activities also had to be provided for the prisoners of war per the Geneva Convention laws. So here's the interior of some of the accommodations. I was reading about how, I think it was over in Hartford, Wisconsin, they had the option, well, not the option, but there were two ways of having accommodations for the prisoners of war there. One of them was in the grand ballroom, that huge building that was there, where the different performers like Lawrence Welk and Duke Ellington, like they used to come through and perform. Or you could get a smaller shed similar to this one. And the prisoners of war actually preferred the smaller building because it was a lot less noisy, a lot less smoky, and probably a lot less stinky too. They were doing their laundry, however. So even their underpants had to classify them as prisoners of war. All of this was provided by the War Department, all of their clothing was. So you can see why that one gentleman who had his back to the camera earlier, why he had the PW done so many times. I mean, this is pretty rough. Interestingly, Camp Cambria, when news came that the camp was going to be here, a notice was put in the Cambria newspaper, and they were asking local residents to offer to do the laundry for the camp guards and Army officers. Not for the prisoners, but for those staffing it. I thought that was interesting too. I hadn't come across that for the other camps. Recreation was also another important part of camp life. Some soccer teams were actually officially organized between the camps. And so you would hear about soccer matches, or not between the camps, but teams were organized at the camps for different teams among the prisoners of war to play against each other. So, do we think that nobody escaped ever from these camps? It was actually very few instances of that. But we've got notice of two of those situations happening. The first was in spring of 1944. A 19-year-old named Otto Gorschluter and 30-year-old Wilhelm Ermeling escaped from Camp Columbus. The local radio notified the area citizens, farmers, and the sheriff's posse was searching for them. The 19-year-old Gorschluter stopped at a farm in Rio and actually asked to be returned to Columbus. As Peter was saying, when you find yourself in the middle of middle America, where can you really go? Ermeling stopped for water at a farmhouse, also outside of Rio. but a farmer recognized his description from the radio and called the sheriff. The prisoner of war did not fight the return to the camp. However, neither man stayed at Camp Columbus, and there were no future escape attempts recorded. All right, Peter's up next.
Okay, here we get into some of the interesting stuff.
Oh, yes, of course, sorry. Go for it.
Okay, fraternization was discouraged by the government, but many of the people fed the prisoners. It started out, they would pack a lunch and they would have a lunch at noon. That kind of evolved into, in a number of cases, the farmers saying, well, you know, come in and eat lunch with us at the kitchen table. The wife, being a good German, was probably making good German food, you know, sauerkraut and schnitzel and all kinds of good things. So legally, you were not supposed to fraternize. The other question is, what was going on with all these young girls, with all of these handsome, blonde-haired, tall, German 19-year-old men? Was there fraternization? Yes. How much of that, we're not sure. There's some stories that, you know, suggest that some of the young girls were out running after the prisoners. I don't totally buy that, but was there interaction between young American girls and German prisoners of war? The answer is yes. And there's some stories that take it even a step further than that. There were many German natives in Columbus. They felt it important to help their countrymen. You know, once a German, always a German. That yes, you were American, but you were very proud of your German heritage. There are even a couple of stories out there of a prisoner of war coming to a camp and finding his brother, who had immigrated to America years before that. So in a number of cases, these Germans did find relatives, and in some cases they were allowed to, on some rare occasions, actually, you know, go see your brother, your uncle, your whatever. So there was some of that type of thing going on. Another thing is that many of the people in town kind of saw the German prisoners kind of as a circus sideshow, and they would line up at the camp fence and watch them playing soccer or watch them singing German songs. So there was quite a bit of that type of thing going on also. And, you know, as a German prisoner of war, to be able to talk to somebody who understood your language was
a lot of them spoke English. A lot of German prisoners of war could speak English.
right.
Yeah.
The other thing we didn't mention is, where did these prisoners come from? In '44, most of them were from Rommel's Africa Corps in North Africa.
Especially here in Cambria.
Right. 45, there were more from France, post D-Day, but the first batch of prisoners were primarily the Africa Corps. Many of the prisoners couldn't believe what American farms looked like. Back in Germany, if you had 2 cows, you were a rich man. Well, you came to America and somebody might have 20, 30 cows. I don't think too many people had more than that back in the 40s. But they were just amazed by the size of the farms. I think they were probably amazed by some of the mechanization. Tractors are just become more popular. Describing camps, this next line: citizens gave the camp, this is Columbus, gave the camp a piano and organ, violins, guitar, saxophone, French horn, and drum set with support of the YMCA. So Columbus actually had a German prisoner of war orchestra. Now, when you're talking about camps, every camp was a little bit different. You know, a big thing was who the commanding officer was. Some were strict, totally by the book. Others realized that you probably could improve morale if you did a few nice things to prisoners. One of those is one account says that Kurt Brewery in Columbus supplied a keg of beer every week. Generally, you weren't supposed to give alcohol to the prisoners, but that was frequently broken. And you know, just imagine that if you had beer and it was a good German, and you offered him beer if he did what you wanted him to do, that was quite an incentive. The other part of the incentives is, or I think I can mention it here. You gonna mention punishments?
You go ahead.
Okay. There really wasn't a lot that you could do to punish. The first thing you could do is you could put them on bread and water on a reduced ration for a period of time until they were willing to come around. The second thing is when they were earning money, about 90 cents a day, that money could go towards the canteen. And guess what the canteen had? It had tobacco. You know, and if you're probably a young gentleman in the 1940s, there were probably more people that smoked than didn't. So there was this incentive that to get things from the canteen if you behaved. And the third thing is they could put you in solitary confinement, which was a tent alone from everybody else. And I guess the fourth thing is they could send you to a real prison, you know, like Fort Leavenworth or various other places where you were actually, you know, physically behind bars. So those types of things were used as an incentive to keep people in line. I mentioned the camp orchestra in Columbus. Each camp was a little bit different. Hartford, they showed movies to the prisoners. You know, did the prisoners know what was going on? Yes, they did. They did have mail from Germany. They did have the Red Cross giving them things. And if they went to a movie, we all remember movies. Part of the movie was a
Newsreel?
yeah, newsreel. There was all, you know, whenever we went to the movies, there was a newsreel. And of course, what was the newsreel about? It was, you know, crossing this bridge in Germany or whatever. So they had some ideas of what was going on. As I mentioned, eventually they changed from prisoners bringing a lunch with them to the requirement that the locals actually fed the people working on their farms. Majority of the prisoners of war did not want to go back to Germany. There was a rule though, and I think we'll get into this a little bit later. Everybody that was a prisoner of war had to go back to Germany. And where I mentioned the canteen where they earned money, some of that money could go into a savings account for the prisoner, and there are records of somebody leaving America with $100 in their pocket to go back to Germany. $100 in the 1940s, well, that's a pretty good sum of money. One of the reasons a lot of them didn't want to go back is, you know, Germany had been pretty much destroyed. High unemployment, which was just the opposite in the United States, because in the United States, what did we do after the war? Everybody needed a new car, everybody had worked overtime and long hours during the war, they had money, I can remember my parents had a 1935 car, and back in 47, boy, we got a new one, which was, you know, really the modern car. One of the dimensions, go to the next slide. Oh, no, yeah, it is.
Cambria's minus one. Do you want to see the next one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna, this is some information on the, situation in Cambria. One of the things is every Sunday, they'd head to Lake, what is it, Tarrant? Tarrant Lake for a swim on the opposite side of the community swimming spot. And then they'd be singing and marching. German POWs were not allowed to work with open food for fear they'd poison it or sabotage the equipment. Therefore, their main duties were labeling, boxing, loading assignments, and working on farms. Now, earlier Ellen showed you the picture of pea vines. I worked briefly in a canning company. Back when I worked there, they had liners that went right into the fields. I think many of us can remember the stationary viners. You cut the peas, you dumped the whole thing on a wagon, you took it to a stationary vine.
A lot of viners were here in Cambria, and there was Wisconsin boys pitching on some of them, and German prisoners. And that rule you got where they have time off every hour, a guy named A.A. Keene was in charge. And he didn't like that, because the Wisconsin boys didn't get any time off. The German prisoners marched back to the camp. The next day they had it resolved. Is that on there?
Yeah, I think we need to get an oral history from this gentleman. We didn't have to read the books, Peter. We just could have met him at the bar.
Do you remember the camp? Do you remember the camp?
Yeah, sure. And also,
Why
my
aren't you up here
uncle
instead of me?
had prisoners come out. The first year, 4 or 5 came out and they shocked grain. And then my uncle, they served them dinner. The next year they had to bring a guard with them. And the guard just stood there with his gun. And they were gonna have to feed him. And my uncle got upset. The prisoners went back to camp. All those little problems.
Yeah, little things.
Yeah, and the 10-minute breaks and that was a part of the, I think, the Geneva Convention. Okay, Glenn.
I forgot, I didn't get the Door County photos, sorry.
Okay, I think we've mentioned most of this. We'll do next.
Yep, so the next slide.
Take evening meds. It's 7:30.
Some of these Germans are very talented people, and they did wood carving, etc. As the war came to a close, in many cases they give that as gifts. I'm gonna skip on because I think we.
Oh, okay, I had a couple things to pop in there, if I could. Thank you. So, a couple of other recollections were that when prisoners of war were working at the Borden's Dry Milk Company, they were actually, one of the things that they were fed during their noon meal and at their midnight meals, depending on what shift they were on, was corn on the cob. And they were very upset. The prisoners of war were extremely upset to be fed corn on the cob. They said, "This is for pigs. This is for our livestock. We do not eat this." And the Americans who were their co-workers and the guards said, "Wait, no, you have to try this corn. If you put butter and salt on it, it's delicious." And so the German prisoner of war soldiers, they tasted it and they were so excited about it, they actually were asking for seeds of the corn to bring home to plant back in Germany when they would return. Will you be talking about how they worked a lot longer after the war ended here?
The war in Germany ended May 8th, 1945, but they still needed people, so the prisoners of war did not leave until 1946. They were needed for the 1945 PPAC. I have a couple of things here yet, but,
You want Kurt?
I'll do that later. I think you've sat for quite a while. I do wanna mention, we have 2 slides, so we'll talk about people. This gentleman over here, anything else you wanna say since?
Well, Friesland wanted to have a post office, but everything was named Randolph. And, that was, I think it was called Randolph Center.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
Lo and behold, I don't know whoever invented the word Friesland, but that's, otherwise we had Randolph, we had South Randolph.
I can tell you how you Friesland.
Okay, tell me.
Friesland is a province in Holland,
You bet.
North Holland. So that's where our good Dutch,
But I never heard who was brave enough to make the suggestion up here to bring that for the name.
Well, you know, naming things, have a long history. Rio is Ohio, but somebody dropped the O.
Oh,
Okay, why don't we get to the point of doing some questions? You've probably listened to us long enough.
No, what I was gonna say, I've read that Friesland got its name changed because there was Randolph and Friesland was Randolph Center. And a lot of the people that were coming into the United States on the train were dropped off at Randolph Center, which is now Friesland. However, their relatives were in Randolph, so there was a lot of confusion between Randolph Center and Randolph. And so they realized they had to change the name because there was too much confusion getting off at the depot. And a lot of the people that landed in Friesland were of Dutch descent. And as a result, they took on the name Friesland.
Questions?
What would happen if they refused to work in the candy factories?
Probably, if you totally refuse to work, that might have got you on bread and water, or that might have got you on solitary confinement. There are records of, some of the prisoners being more ambitious than others. Some of them didn't particularly enjoy working in the fields, you know, pitching peat vines, cutting corn.
oh, if I can add to that. So if they were causing a lot of trouble at their camp, then they would be removed to another camp. So I'd never heard of anyone refusing to work. It was more like different, prisoners of war having conflict, which didn't happen too often, but had been recorded.
There's also records of, kind of a lax, guarding of prisoners. There's one where the, guard would fall asleep, and when the camp commandant came along and he knew he was coming, he'd wake up the guard and give him his gun back. There's other things, I think this might have been Oakfield. One other thing that was a popular crop was sugar beets. You know, sugar was on the list of rationed items. Half of, or more than half of the sugar in the United States was from sugar beets. And so they gave each prisoner a machete, which has a hook on the end, and what you do is you lop off the top of the sugar beet, and then you take the hook and you dig out the rut, and then you throw the whole sugar beet, you know, in a wagon. So here you have a camp of, what, 100, 200 guys, each with a machete. So that's suggestive that they weren't super worried about what prisoners were gonna do.
Also, I forget if we mentioned this, but a lot of the guards of the camp, they had been soldiers during World War I, so they may have even been familiar with the, you know, German culture from having served overseas too. Are you gonna talk?
Well,
Please.
yeah.
I think, do you wanna hear a little bit more? Couple more minutes?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. It's exciting stuff. It's really good.
Okay, I'm gonna somewhat highlight 2 people. One is Kurt Peckman. Anybody ever heard of him? Okay. Peckman was a prisoner of war. He was, I believe he was in Cambria. And
Columbus, and possibly Cambria as well.
Columbus, possibly Cambria, possibly Lodi. He was a master carver of granite, and he loved the United States so much that back in, I think it was 50 or 51, he immigrated back to America. He started a monument company in Madison, which is still in existence. And one of the things he did is he participated and donated a number of war memorials that we have. We have one in Columbus that he did. I think he did one on the state capitol grounds. He did the one up in Clover. So he was a master stone worker, and he has recollections of when they did it all by hand, and then later on when they became mechanized.
Well, the word was to come back, you had to get a sponsor in this country. Now, I don't, that's.
Okay, I'm gonna mention that on the next one.
Oh.
What a segue. Hans Schwark lived in, or was in Cambria. He was a prisoner of war. He was captured in North Africa. Peckman was captured in Russia. He was captured in North Africa. He spent his time in camp here. He became friends with the family. He became friends with Gilbert Jones.
Yeah.
Became a very close friend of his. And in the, right around 1950, he sponsored Hans to come to America. He borrowed it with either $600 or $800 from, excuse me, William Manthe, and sponsored Hans, his wife, and his very young child. He ended up coming back to Cambria a few times. I don't know, does anybody recognize him?
Don't recognize him, but Gib Jones was injured in the First World War, but he was a rural mail carrier here for many, many years. Yeah.
Well, when I was in first grade, Marilyn and I, there was a girl, a German girl, that joined our class for a while, and I wonder, that would have been 1955.
Was her name Sabine?
Maybe,
That was his daughter's name.
but was he around here in 1955?
He came back on, I believe it was 51, and he spent a few years here. He was offered a job with stock. He understood it to be the stock market. It was raising. He wasn't so excited about it, so he did quit that job. He went to work in Randolph. There was a educational company that sold Educator Progress. He worked for them for a few years, and then he moved to Waukesha and ended up living there, worked at Wisconsin Paper. The amazing thing is I looked at that name, and I looked at that name, and that was my daughter's first job, and I said, tell me about Hans. And she said, well, he was proud to be a German. When he worked for Wisconsin Paper, he always drove a Mercedes, because that was a good German car and well made. He was a mentor towards a number of young people, and both of these gentlemen died fairly recently.
2020
March 8th, 2020.
and 2000 on the screen.
Ripe old age.
2009. So these are just two individuals that I brought up. If you wanna look, both of those obituaries are online. Another piece of, you just handed that to me.
Oh, the letter?
Yeah. There is something called the Edward Langer History Site. And there's a chronology of Hans Schwark, you know, when he came to America, where he was at, that type of thing. You can find it online.
Where he fought in Germany, or
Yeah.
where he fought in Africa and his capture.
His capture, et cetera, et cetera. It's kind of a life history of his. It's called the Edward Langer History Site. And
Did you want the,
Fond du Lac Reporter had a long news article, just like us, how Wisconsin held captive and made peace with German POWs in World War II. And this is on Kurt Beckman, so probably some of these things, maybe we'll get copies to the library. And if you ask them, I'm sure they could help you find them.
can I give just a
Yeah.
couple stats to wrap things up? Would that, or pass it back to you then? So the prisoners of war, by the end of the war in Cambria, the prisoners of war, German prisoners of war, were working in the Cambria, Friesland, Hardyville area on 4 different prisoner of war work contracts. So between June 10, 1944 and September 1945, they put in over 53,204 man hours. So that was a lot to help replace the labor force that was overseas. Also, in terms of making money for the United States Treasury, it was recorded in August of 1945 that they made $28,483. And somehow, by the next month, the numbers that were recorded and then reported, they nearly doubled it to $41,439. So, also, let's see, in Columbus, the mid-September numbers from 1945 reported that the prisoners of war had earned $59,420 for the government. So my husband, he studied economics, and so we were looking at the inflation rate online, and so this isn't 100% accurate, but with approximately a 3.7% rate of inflation that comes from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, their inflation calculator, by August of 2022, that $59,000 and change was worth over $972,291.76 that would have brought in money. Like, it was the equivalent of that in 1945. So it's pretty remarkable. I mean, the prisoner of war labor workforce, that essentially saved the U.S. economy, farming economy, it sounds like.
Is there any evidence of the prisoner of war camp left in Cambria? You know, like at the Canning Company or anything like that?
The field is still there, this guy lives next to it.
Where they were.
Okay.
We've lived there for 45 years. It seems like in the early years when the farmer would work the field, he'd find some pottery or something, some shards, but nothing.
Yeah.
Would you like to
Sure.
read this article?
Oh, yeah.
Didn't it grow from
I know.
Cambria to Yonge?
The sheep sheds in Columbus still exist. They were used for years and years for migrant labor, and they weren't particularly fancy. This is an article from 1944. Flirting with Nazi prisoners, or even showing too much interest in these former enemies of our nation, is one way to become unpopular in Columbia County. It may be concluded from reports of events which took place at Cambria last night. One young lady working in the plant was thrown into a water tank because others on the job felt she had long exhibited too much interest and the war prisoners. This disciplinary measure failed to meet with the full approval of management, according to reports, but the Portage girls who worked at the plant are fully convinced that their action was justified. It might be added in this connection that the vast majority of Americans feel that all prisoners of war should be treated in accordance with the terms of international law, but that they should be totally ignored by civilians. Someday they'll go back to Germany, and we would not want them to tell that most Americans are friendly and interested in them. In the German and Nazi mind, this would be interpreted as a weakness, and it's evident that Americans are not in support of the war effort. Now, that's published in 1944. Was that Cambria paper, probably?
Yes.
You know, what did people think of prisoners? And maybe I'll end with that.
We're going to go to war again.
But,
And I don't like what's happening.
if you lost a husband, son, father in World War II, you probably didn't care much for prisoners of war. So there was this group of people that just hated them because they were German Nazis.
Well, I can't remember any specific, but if you weren't sort of in support of the war, people would do things because they kind of tie you in with the Germans. A lot of them were Germans. Sometimes I guess they had yellow paint put on some of their property. Yeah, that was and if you needed a tire, you had to go and find a man to look at your tire, and then you had to go and find a tire because there wasn't any. The same with sugar. Some people I knew, when the sugar was delivered to the candy factory, they would lose a bag where that person lived.
I have one jolly escape anecdote I forgot, which would be a fun one for you all. So one time, I forget which camp, I read about several camps, but there was a German prisoner of war soldier who did not return to camp. Everyone was searching and searching and searching for him. They were out in the fields, they were on the roads looking and looking and looking. They found him in the local pub, pulled up to the bar, enjoying a beer with his fellow German Americans.
Yeah.
When I mentioned the Japanese, I maybe should make this comment. Part of the Japanese culture was that you don't become a prisoner of war, and many of the Japanese were fearful that when they were sent back to Japan, if they would be punished or even killed because they allowed themselves to be captured.
Well,
So
but
the
there was
Japanese
Japanese been here for quite a few years in California. They had crops to harvest, and they were hauled off and put in a prisoner camp in Utah. One of those guys was working with the canning factory down here at Marshall.
Yeah, that's a story that many well, there was always this fear if you lived on the West Coast, East Coast, that Japanese Americans were gonna sabotage
Yeah.
the war effort, and so we decided to move them to the interior. That's kind of the history of a lot of places. Okay, I think we probably talked much longer than some of you expected. Any final?
I just wanted to say that, we lived at our place for 45 years, and it's next to the field where the prisoner of war camp was. But our neighbor, Henry Shave, was a prisoner of war himself in World War II. It would have been interesting to hear what he felt about that thought.
If you have anybody with recollections, boy, get them on tape.
Here's Peter's email too, for your own society too. Our president of the Columbus Area Historical Society is the city communications manager, David Bennett, and so we've spoken with him. He became our president last fall, and he's open to recording oral histories in conjunction with some local history. You had a question or comment?
Is there, any, statistics on how many prisoner of wars came back and lived in the United States?
I haven't seen that statistic, but it was a sizable number. When they came back, there were quotas as to how many German immigrants we would take in any particular year. So you had to get permissions, you had to, get that visa. I have not seen that. But all of the records suggest that there were a lot of them that wanted to come back.
Did they come back here then, any of them?
Well, as Peckman came to Madison.
Yeah.
Bernie Brewer from Beaver Dam. Bernie Brewer from Brewer Metalcraft from Beaver Dam came back. And George Hall from Stainless Steel from Beaver Dam. And then George Hall moved to Columbus and had business there, so
Okay,
they
we
came
ran
back.
across that name when we
Yeah.
were doing some of the research. So there were a number of them. This gentleman, ended up in Milwaukee at a paper company, but, yeah, there were a lot of them that came back, but I don't have a statistic.
I think we're gonna keep working on this because a lot of communities are interested in learning more. So if you have more information for us, we have Peter's email right here. And then, I'll keep working on this together. We have a lot more resources than just this, a lot more sources, but, that's the start.
I think I'm spying that there's some refreshments in the back of the room.
Yeah.
Wanna-
There's also some copies from Stella, Wisconsin on the same, back there for you. That
Thank
Peter told me I won't go to prison for.
It's not the whole book, it's just, thank you for having us.
Thank you.